I've never been a big fan of agnosticism. While it's fine to be uncertain about any number of your beliefs, I've never subscribed to the idea that the God question is something where anything more than uncertainty is just hubris. Well, you can technically argue in a philosophical sense that you can't really be certain about anything because you don't know you're not just living in a matrix, you don't know you're not just a brain in a vat. But in general conversation, we might as well say that we're certain about some things. This point about the fact that you can't be completely certain about anything, it's kind of a useful analogy to employ in philosophical debates, but just in general conversation, it's not that relevant. We all know colloquially what we mean by we're certain about something. And I don't think it's necessary that the question of whether or not there's a God is something that you should be uncertain about. There are a lot of good arguments on either side. If you think about theology and atheism for a very long period of time, then chances are you probably have cultivated a pretty strong opinion about yes, there is probably a God, or no, there's almost definitely not a God. When someone says, no, I'm just truly agnostic, I have no idea whether there's a God. Well, you might not know, but to have no idea, are you positing that there's an exactly 50-50 chance that there is or is not a God? It's kind of a strange position. What you should do is just look around the world, try to assess the evidence that is available to you, whether or not you observe, just empirically or spiritually, a God in the universe, and if you do not, if you look for all of the spaces that God could potentially occupy and you find nothing, well then fair enough, you can use Occam's razor to conclude that probably there is no God, but at least pick a side. At this point, I feel like any atheists who might have stumbled across this video, most atheists also consider themselves agnostic, so those atheists are probably being unconvinced right now. They probably take some issue with my wording or something. So let me use an analogy that probably puts this in a better perspective that makes it more easy to understand, because this is an analogy that atheists themselves bring up all the time. The question of the Greek and Roman gods, gods like Zeus or Thor. Now, do you think that Zeus or Thor exists? Well, I guess it's possible if I completely change my idea of what is possible in the universe, what the laws of physics are, just what's possible in general, then if I completely suspend my understanding of the universe as it is up until this point, then I can rationalize the idea that maybe there is Zeus or Thor. But I don't do this. And do I declare myself agnostic about the question of whether Thor exists? Do I declare myself agnostic about the question of whether Zeus exists? No, I confidently declare there is no Zeus, there is no Thor, because it's obvious. Despite the small possibility that these could exist, I just don't think there's much use to using the word as agnostic, because although it's technically true, it's also kind of vacuous in the context that I would be employing it. But on this same basis, if you don't believe in the Christian God, don't waste my time by giving me this whole big rationalization about how you're agnostic about it. Just confidently tell me that, notwithstanding understandable doubt that everyone has, you think there is no Christian God. This all brings me to one atheist, prominent speaker, debater, thinker, Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty, one of his favorite things to say is, I don't know. Is there a God? I don't know. Is there this? I don't know. And this isn't a criticism of him. He confidently talks about how often he says, I don't know. It's a big part of his style of agnosticism. I don't know is not some statement of defeat. It's more like, I don't know and I'm going to figure out. And even if I never figure out, at least I'm better than those arrogant people who claim to have all the answers. And here's my problem with that. The thing is, it's fine to say, I don't know, if you're just a philosopher and you need to investigate a question and you don't know the answer, and you should start out saying, I don't know, just so that you're open to all possibilities. But the problem is that when we operate in the actual world, there are many situations in which it is incumbent upon us to act in situations where you don't know, where there is incomplete information, where there are two options, A or B, and A could lead to some set of behaviors, B leads to a separate set of behaviors, but you don't know which one is true, well, you have to guess. You have to take some set of behaviors that either aligns with A or B, and in some situations there's no middle ground. You need to simply act in the face of not knowing, in the face of incomplete information. In other words, you need to guess. And as it happens, there's a whole branch of academic study, a fusion of economics and mathematics, that deals with this question. It's called decision theory. Decision theory is basically concerned with a few things. It's concerned with A, what options are there? What possibilities are there? B, how likely is each of those possibilities? And C, if each of those possibilities were to come true, then what is the payoff or downside to each of those possibilities? What is the utility that is derived if each of those possibilities were to come true? And consequently, what choices should we make? What actions should we make to maximize our possible utility? When we do the calculations of the likelihood of each option and the potential payoffs of each option, then we can come to an almost empirical decision. Of course, in the real world, most decisions are a bit more messy than this. We have even less information than this. But it at least shows that just saying I don't know is not the height of intellectual vigor, because we do have to make decisions. Now, in this video, I'm going to go to someplace perhaps a little bit unexpected, unless I chose to put it in the title, and that's veganism. Just so that you understand my biases in this question, I should obviously prefix this portion by stating what my own opinion of veganism is. I am not a vegan, I do eat meat. I don't think there's any ethical reason not to eat meat. In fact, I think there's no ethical problem with eating meat. That's my opinion. Not that it affects anything that I'm saying, I just think I might as well say it. But about 1 or 2 years ago, I don't know exactly when, Matt Dillahunty got into what can only be described as a series of arguments about veganism. I'm not saying it was like a major thing that he argued, but he was questioned about veganism, and so he argued about it a little bit. And Matt Dillahunty, at the time, I can only speak to what he thought then. I don't know if he's changed or updated his views since the period that I'm talking about. Matt Dillahunty was not vegan. He was okay with eating meat. And I think this serves to get across my point because the way that people think about the veganism debate is perhaps different or differently emotionally charged than the way people think about the religious debate. So why do I bring it up? Well, because it's easy to imagine that the criticisms, the critiques that I have made so far against agnosticism and against the idea of saying I don't know, they're completely misguided and they really miss the way that Matt Dillahunty means it. I'm missing the essence of the arguments that Dillahunty is actually making. But if we step back and look at a debate Matt Dillahunty had about veganism, which frankly is a topic I'm not particularly that interested in, it can bring into focus the failures of Matt Dillahunty's thinking. Because what does he say in defense of eating meat?
The problem here is not that I don't understand what you mean by needless. The problem here is that you are assuming that I am making a case for something being morally permissible when I am saying that I have not been convinced that something should be morally impermissible.
Is it because they can't
nobody
reciprocate?
From your side has made an argument that it should be a moral obligation.
Okay, like
the default is freedom until there's a good reason to limit that freedom.
Okay,
the
so
default
you
is
want the freedom to
right.
needlessly kill animals.
He says, I have heard from the vegans, I have heard their arguments, and I have not heard in the vegan arguments any sufficient reason to believe, any convincing reason to believe that eating meat is bad. And until I hear such a reason as to convince me that eating meat is bad, then I will continue to eat meat, because I have no reason not to eat meat if I haven't heard a reason that it's bad. Right now, I have no idea whether eating meat is bad. I have not thought about it, I have no idea. I don't know, it could be good, it could be bad, I don't know. But I will continue to eat meat. Now, I don't know if this strikes other people the same way, but when I heard this argument, it struck me as quite strange, because the thing is, Matt Dillahunty claims that he has no idea, well maybe he does have an idea, but he's using this same kind of rhetorical line. He's using this statement, I don't know whether eating meat is bad. But when you look at his actions, do his actions really bear that out? Because he does eat meat, which means that he is living as though he is living as one would live if one believed that eating meat was not bad. And is that really the rational thing to do? If I had no idea whether eating meat was right or wrong, then I would probably opt to not eat meat just to be on the safe side. Like, if one option was that eating meat was perfectly fine, and another option was that eating meat was murder, well, I would probably choose to not eat meat in that case if each option was equally likely, because, well, do you really want to do a thing that has a 50% chance of being murder and just a 50% chance of being fine? Do you want to take that risk? You should probably opt just to be on the safe side, just to do the action that is the least likely of having any negative harm, which is not eating meat. Nothing wrong can possibly happen because of that. I would almost kind of respect him more if he made a sort of argument. I'm not claiming he would ever make such an argument, but if he said something along the lines of, well, I don't even care if eating meat is murder because, I gotta eat meat. I would almost respect him more if he said something like that. Because what he did in that debate, it's just confusing to hear such windy, almost weaselly logic from someone who otherwise sounds like a straight talker kind of guy. And I think this topic might get at deeper questions with respect to Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to evidence. I don't think I'm able to adequately elaborate on that topic here, but he comes from a sort of school of thought where you have a null hypothesis, and that null hypothesis is assumed true until it is disproved. If it is not disproved, then you just assume it is true and act accordingly. But he's taking it beyond what that approach was originally meant for. It's kind of a tool to make sure that scientists aren't just trying to confirm their own biases, which means they explicitly state what the null hypothesis is that they're positing, and then it is incumbent on the person who posited the null hypothesis to themselves go out and try to disprove it, and disprove it with all of the academic and scientific rigor that is necessary. So it is useful when analyzing a scientific paper. You don't want to let your biases cloud how you interpret the scientific paper. So in that context, it actually is useful to adopt a sort of position of pure negation just to analyze empirically whether the scientific paper meets its standard of evidence. It's a sort of agnosticism when you read the paper, just to try to figure out how scientifically rigorous it is. But I don't see the point of agnosticism outside of that exercise. Just to say generally, over the course of all of the material that I've read, none of it has convinced me of anything, and so I will believe nothing. No, I mean, that's good for when you're just reading something dispassionately. You want to start out with a blank slate mind, but you also want to cultivate opinions throughout the whole process of reading a lot of different materials. Every position has a certain burden of proof associated with it. Saying there is a God definitively, it has a certain burden of proof. Saying there definitively is no God has a certain burden of proof. And you read a lot of materials and you can say none of the information I've read has met any burden of proof. But still, there are degrees of this. Some material might be more convincing than others. You want to look at the evidence with discretion and then evaluate it and come to an opinion about what's probably the case given that. And there are lots of different arguments about how to interpret the evidence. Even a total lack of evidence, you can argue in certain situations of it being a type of evidence, that if some phenomenon existed, you would expect to see evidence of it. Now, none of this is to preclude the possibility of black swans, because there are any number of phenomena that we could have no idea about, but to presuppose a specific black swan, in the case of a dearth of evidence for it, that is getting into the realm of the unlikely. I'm not making the case for atheism, I'm just making the case that atheists should be more confident in their beliefs. And I guess what I inevitably need to say is that there's a fundamental difference in perspective, philosophical perspective, about proving atheism. Because I've heard many atheists say that they have a view about proving a negative, where it's just difficult or impossible to prove a negative, so it's unfair to ask them to prove a negative. And then according to them, atheism is purely negation, so it's unfair to ask them to prove atheism when it's essentially impossible to do so. You can't prove purely negation. But I disagree with this. I think it is possible to prove purely negation. I'll give you an example. Is there a beach ball in my backyard? I can go into my backyard, look around, try to assess whether or not there is a beach ball present. It's kind of hard to miss, and if I don't see a beach ball, I conclude there is no beach ball in my backyard. Well, it's a similar process trying to prove the negation of anything. I would just look where the thing is likely to have an impact, and if I observe no impact, then I conclude that probably the most likely explanation is that that thing does not exist. Not beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I conclude that its negation is the most likely explanation. That is how you prove a negative. So sorry if I bored you with that last section, because now I can get to the ultimate point. Why is it that atheists like Matt Dillahunty, they are so insistent on this very particular brand of negation, of just assuming the null hypothesis, of emphasizing their agnosticism? Well, because essentially they know it's easy. Not consciously, maybe unconsciously, but it is a sort of a framing device, and it's a very useful framing device. If you put the burden of proof on your opponent, then your opponent is fighting an uphill battle. You don't want to have the burden of proof. You always want to shift the burden of proof onto the person you're debating with, even if you're both making claims. And so, logically, the burden of proof should rest on both of you. You always want to frame your statement as if it is just purely negation. Therefore, you don't have any burden of proof. You can just criticize without actually having to build up a positive statement of your own. You can merely just criticize, as in make negative statements, say why statements are fallacious. At a core level, this is just easier. It's much harder to build up than to tear down. It's much easier to employ a sort of critical theory, to poke holes in your opponent's arguments, than it is to actually create a convincing positive argument about what is the case. I would almost go so far as to say that also, the reason why there's a certain brand of leftist critical theory that's so pervasive in modern universities is maybe it's just easier to argue that position. It's much easier to create this position which criticizes things. It has a list of buzzwords, so you always have a list of words to throw in to make yourself sound smart, and it's a convenient template so that you always know what your take is going to be on any issue. You always know you can fit it into this template. You don't have to be creative and come up with your own creative take. And I can tell you it's pretty easy to write an essay from the critical theory perspective. Now, we know, of course, that the people arguing critical theory don't believe in pure negation. They are, in fact, trying to advocate for a really advanced form of ideology, but as a framing device, they use negation, critical theory, criticizing as a useful mechanism because it's easier to argue. But that's not really about atheism, so moving on from that, I can say, as a general statement, that when debating someone, never let your opponent frame it as if you have the sole burden of proof. Now, of course, if you watch this whole video, I'd really recommend you to subscribe because I need way more subscribers than what I have, and I also need a lot of likes on this video so people will actually see it.